wondering if others maybe behind the scene also tried to, and how did you have a hard time maintaining your kind of independent view and not be steered by others and how they wanted to shape it?
Amazingly, I felt like everybody kind of let me make the film I wanted to make, including Harry. So he expressed his reservations up front and in the film, but everybody was very supportive of the process of, the fact that I was making a film that was not necessarily the film that they would have made. So I didn't feel a lot of pressures creatively. And what was amazing about working with the National Film Board of Canada is any pressures that I felt creatively were good pressures. Like, all of those pressures served me well. Like, they were all about pushing it away from formula, pushing it away from a sort of typical personal film. Like, it was all about how can we think further outside of the box and be innovative as opposed to formulaic and more accessible. And I think that's a pressure you will only get from a financer if it's a public financer and it's not sort of about the bottom line. So I did feel like I had a lot of creative freedom, but obviously there was a lot of self-imposed pressure of hearing the voices of everyone I knew and what I assumed they would think of it and what I thought they would be uncomfortable with or judge. And I turned out to be wrong about most of it. Like, certainly with my immediate family, like my siblings and my dad, they all watched it the week before we locked picture and nobody had any issues with it, which really surprised me.
Okay, there was somebody, yeah.
What I loved about the film was it wasn't just a documentary, it was also the making of a documentary. And I was wondering how you chose to do that. I thought it was really very refreshing and interesting.
I think that came about quite organically when we did the first interview with my dad, which we shot on, I think it was a Sony F900, and my cinematographer, Iris Ng, who really was a collaborator from way before I started, actually shooting, had this idea of knowing we were going to be using a lot of archival footage, said, why don't I shoot some Super 8 B-roll? And I just thought that was totally insane and totally like her to think of something totally experimental and not at all appropriate. And then we watched it, and it was amazing what the impact it had on us, because just the format of Super 8 triggers so much, I think. And when we watched this footage that we had shot just a week ago on Super 8, it started to sort of talk to us about how even that moment a week ago was already relegated to the past, was already totally subjective, that like 5 minutes ago is basically up for grabs in terms of what happened. Like, as soon as something has happened, who knows what happened, and it's all about our versions. And so we realized that the format was actually talking more eloquently about the subject matter than anything we could put in the film. And I think that was the beginning of realizing this has to be about the construction of this story as well, because to pretend that we are accurately conveying all these different versions is a lie. Like, this is a construction in itself, and we have to acknowledge that. But it became a little bit of a Russian doll where it was like, oh my God, like the number of layers got kind of confusing at times. We were shooting on so many formats, and we were, gunning towards this giant theater sequence in the end on 35, and thank God that didn't happen.
Let's see here. Is there somebody right there?
Yeah, someone right over here.
I see.
Right there.
Yeah.
I loved your movie. It was really awesome. Can you tell me what your current relationship is with Harry now?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, it's good. Like, I have a really, really close relationship with his daughter, Kathy, and I know his son, Jim, less because he lives abroad. I have a really great relationship with my niece, Kathy's daughter, and, he's been very supportive of the film. He's come to screenings, and
Does it ever get difficult with your dad and Harry and just kind of that pull?
no, because Harry lives in Montreal. I don't see him a lot, to be honest. So, I see my dad, a few times a week at least, and I don't think that's ever been an issue. I mean, the other thing is, it's kind of clear who your family is, right? I mean, like, this is a really amazing experience, and I got to meet these incredibly interesting people through this. But my dad raised me, and my dad's my dad, and so it's not a confusion, I don't think, for anybody. So no, that hasn't been difficult. In fact, they've met a few times and talked for long periods of time, and both it's been totally fine. So yeah.
got time for a couple more. Okay, I see someone over there.
Yes, you spoke of Harry's kind of monologue where he talks about how the film will be structured if he is not the main part of the story. He essentially defines what you put on screen. Now, did you realize that when he said it to you in the interview, or did you realize it afterward when you put the film together?
I think when he was talking about it, I mean, I think the case he makes is so convincing that I realized that it had to become a kind of centerpiece of the film. I had to build a sequence around it, or I'd have to leave it out. And leaving it out would make the film kind of a lie, because the truth is he had kind of convinced me of something in that moment. So I felt like it was really important I felt like actually it was one of the most interesting things that happened in any of the interviews, so I really wanted to draw a lot of focus to it. And while he was talking about it, I think I was envisioning that sequence.
Can we talk real quick about the idea, whose idea was it to have Michael in the recording studio recording what he wrote? Because there's a lot going on in those scenes, and you come back to them a lot. I mean, it's not enough just to hear it, you want to just see that. And not only do we see him reading it, but you cut to you reacting to some of the more poignant things that might be painful or uncomfortable, like talking about sex or talking about the affair. Why did you, because we were saying before how we don't really get your version, but we do get a little there of you. Can you talk a little bit about including that and why you wanted to show him recording and not just hearing it?
I mean, I feel like my role in the film wasn't to sort of give my version as much as it was to show my process as a filmmaker trying to make this film. And that was sort of, in a funny way, my characters, the filmmaker who's investigating. And so that was part of, I think, showing that. I think that I never thought that stuff would end up in the film, to be honest. I wanted to get my dad into the recording studio to record everything he'd written to make sure I had it, and then I was going to figure out how to incorporate it later. And then it was sort of an afterthought to film it, and then it was Nita Lee, our producer, who insisted there be a second camera on me, which I thought was totally like batshit crazy. I was like, I don't know, okay, that's great. Like, I'm never going to put my reactions to this very boring process in the film. But we sort of used it as a placeholder before we shot this theater sequence. And then as we used it, we realized, oh, this actually is that frame. Like, we've created the frame already. So yeah, it was like 3 or 4 days in a recording studio. And I think just some of the moments that happened between us just kind of told us so much. I mean, they're humiliating to watch the first time. It's like, he's saying these totally emotional things. I'm like, can you just do that again?
That's the funny thing.
It's just like, I believe how awful you get when you're making a film. Like, it's a real sort of window into like how people can lose their humanity completely. So I thought, well, I guess I have to include that because, it's dishonest not to, but there's a ruthlessness, I think, to when you're trying to tell a story. I mean, that's another aspect. When you're trying to tell a story, you get kind of single focused about it, and it's so meaningful to you that you kind of ignore everything that happens along the way. So.
Dad, can you reread that really emotional part again and make it mean something, for God's sakes? All right, we got time for a couple more here, if there are any. If there's a hand up.
A couple in the corner there, Steve. To your left.
Somebody say something. Go ahead. Does somebody?
Oh, okay.
Oh, there we go.
I'll
There you
just
go.
ask, this is kind of a jumping off from that one. Can you give some background on the film of your father going into the swimming pool and making him stay down there? I thought that was hilarious.
It was, I went to the Canadian Film Centre, which was a 6-month intensive director's lab, after I'd made a couple of short films. I think I was 22 at the time. And so our first exercise was to do a montage. And I was just lost. I didn't know what I was gonna do. And so I thought, well, my dad's cinematic. So look at my dad do a whole bunch of weird stuff that's really kind of depressing and odd. And it was actually a deeply disturbing montage that people at the end of the year, when they got drunk, confessed to me that had made them very worried about my emotional well-being. Anyone who, the things I did to him, I had him puking all over himself. And it was just horrible. And but I thought it was hilarious because it was actually set to it was set to high hopes he's got high hopes. There was him chain smoking, playing solitaire and puking, going underwater, then killing himself underwater. I thought it was so funny and nobody agreed. So what that was. And then I had to like try to fish it out when I was putting the film together and ask the people at the film center if they had that. And they looked at me really concerned that this would ever see the light of day. Like, are you sure you want this for your film?
Blu-ray extra,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
Nobody wants to see that.
All right, who's gonna get
Behind the last question there.
Oh, back there,
Yeah.
yeah.
Two questions. One, is the use of Anna Karenina intentional that was on the heater, I believe, by Mark, given the parallels of it? And the other one is, we heard about Harry and Michael's reactions. I was wondering if you had any sense or any notion of what your mother might have said or reacted to in the film.
I actually hadn't noticed that that book is on the heater behind Johnny, and I thought I should check that out. It probably does have meaning that I haven't noticed. Maybe he put it there for a reason. Your second one, my mom's reaction. I mean, that for me is the thing that'll haunt me, right? I mean, I can't possibly know what she would have thought of this, or even what she would have thought of people knowing this. You know, she chose to keep it a secret. So I have like really strong assurances from her closest friends that she would have loved it, that she would have been very mad at me and really loved it. And I tend to feel like that's true, but I'll never know the truth of that. And I think that's probably why it was so hard for me to finish this film, and why I wanted to walk away from it so many times, and why it's very hard for me to sit through, because I feel like every time I see her face up on screen in that audition footage in the black and white, my question is, you know, what would you have thought of this? And I guess I do feel like it was her kind of film in a way, in terms of, you know, the character of my dad, right, who she loved, and, you know, his process. But it's hard to know, and I think it's also a really tough thing to have reconciled myself to the fact that I couldn't show all of who she was in this film. So I show who she is in relation to her children and the men in her life. I don't show anything about what she accomplished outside of that, which was a lot. She was a whole lot of other things other than, you know, someone who partied and was, you know, vivacious and vibrant and funny, and, you know, had these amazing affairs, and, you know, had these children. She also, you know, she produced the first show of Kids in the Hall, and she, you know, was a casting director who really changed the landscape of film and TV in Canada. And she, you know, was a scholar, and, you know, had a degree in philosophy and social work and education. Like, she was a really amazing person, and it's a hard thing to kind of go, this part of her is all that people will know. I feel conflicted about that, especially in the context of someone pointing out to me recently that every female character I've ever had in one of my films, we only get to know them in relationship to the men in their life. That was raised to me by a woman in her 60s, and I was like completely stunned to realize that that was true. So I obviously feel very conflicted when doing that with the character of my mother. So I don't know what she would have thought, but I hope she would have liked it.
It's really like you kind of walk kind of a tightrope of empathy in your audiences with your movies, because you have not only the character of your mother, but Michelle Williams' character in Take This Waltz, who basically, you know, is feeding into her own desires, you know, on what most people might look at as a pretty decent guy, maybe a boring guy, you know, a guy that just makes chicken all the time, but a decent guy. And how do you feel about the audience sort of reacting to, like, hating one character or empathizing with another character? I mean, how do you empathize with both your mother and Michelle Williams' character? If at all.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with Michelle Williams' character, I sort of oscillate. Like, I feel like when I wrote it, I didn't write it with the idea of her being that sympathetic. Like, I actually wrote it initially as almost a kind of morality tale. And then I think that shifted, because I think Michelle brought a lot to the character that I didn't expect, and I also felt a less simplistic movie would be a good thing. But it was interesting to feel like everyone thought I wanted the audience to love her, and felt like it was a problem that they didn't. And I thought that was an interesting projection. But I think for me, the most thrilling thing is if you can make a film and people feel wildly different about the characters from the person sitting next to them. That one person thinks one person's supposed to be the hero and another person thinks. For me, that's really important to me. I really believe strongly in, like, my favorite documentary filmmaker is Alan King, and he actually came to talk to this lab I was a part of when I was developing this film. And I remember him saying, like, just don't create heroes and villains out of your characters. Do not do it. Do not create good and evil, because it's not just that you'll be making a formulaic, boring film. you're actually doing real harm in the world. You're perpetrating an idea that does real harm in the world, this idea that they're good and bad people, or heroes and villains, and that really spoke to me, that actually is damaging the world beyond just your film. So that's really important to me. In terms of my mom, I only sympathize and empathize with the choices she made, which, some of which, were difficult and, create, my siblings' childhood was a nightmare, but there's so many versions that aren't even in the film of, how that all happened. I think it's really hard to judge in retrospect, and I think it's very hard to judge from my position now as, a young woman in 2013, the situation a woman was in like 1967, who, was from a traditional family, was in a traditional marriage, who wanted so much more than her life allowed her and had very little choice and very few rights and was like so obviously discriminated against by the justice system. I think it's very hard to kind of sit from my privileged vantage point and go, you should have done this or should have done that. I mean, I think, women had, all kinds of ways of going crazy under that kind of nightmarish oppression in the 50s and 60s. And I think she did really well considering her circumstances. So, so I don't feel a lot of judgment of anything that she did.
I think we need to wrap it up. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing the film and sharing this part of your life with us and for sticking around for so long. Two quick things. Sarah, Eric would know better than me. I believe Sarah was like the first person to sign up to be a part of this festival.
She was.
Like right from the get-go, and we owe her a huge debt of gratitude for that. And as I heard, the movie is amazing. But and also, if you like this movie, tell everyone you know. Tell everyone you know. A film like this is going to live or die on good reviews, and we'll take care of that. And then you get out there and word of mouth. You have to get out there, use every social media outlet at your disposal, and just tell the world how much you love this movie.
Can you travel with me with the film? This is like a really good pitch. I also just want to say I was very, very honored to be invited to be the first film of this whole film festival. It's kind of amazing. So thank you so much for being here.
And so make sure and tell everyone that Sarah's your favorite Canadian. And thank you guys so much for sticking around. If you are staying for the next film, we still need to clear the theater very quickly. You can leave your stuff here if you want, but we need to clear the theater. We got to do a quick tech check, and then we'll get you right back in here. Thanks.